I spent a significant part of the last few years by figuring out how to render CG landscapes in Blender. In that time, one of the third-party tools that I gradually found myself using more and more was Gaea, a wonderful terrain generator powered by nodes. Have no fear though, node-based doesn't mean difficult. And in this short introduction, I will show you the exact steps on how to generate your first terrain and then take it to Blender. And if you're a first-time Gaea user, now is a great time to start your journey, because there is now version 2 available with lots of improvements from the first one. And what's awesome, there's no subscription, just a one-time fee for a perpetual license, and you can also download the software for free to try it out. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like being overwhelmed with new software. Instead of starting by learning every single nook and cranny of the tool, I like to learn simpler workflows first, so that I know my way around, but not necessarily what every single setting does right off the bat. That I usually learn gradually by using the software. Well, that's exactly what I'll try to do in this tutorial. So the first time you start Gaea, you'll be greeted with this welcome screen, where you can choose a new project. And now, very quickly, down here is where you will put your nodes, and up here you'll be able to see the results of what you're doing, while on the right here, there's your properties window. So everything very similar to Blender actually. The various nodes you have at your disposal are here on the left, and usually you'll be going through them from the top, first adding some terrain primitives or landscape pieces, then you'll variously modify them and erode them, and after that get some extra data from them, colorize, and finally export. So let's get to it. Let me start first by adding a landscape canyon. And by the way, anytime you know the name of the node you're looking for, you can simply right-click here and type it in. Also, if you, like me, hate these nested menus, you can just quickly hop into the settings and change the parameters here to be able to see all of the options in one pop-up menu. The way Gaea works is a bit different from Blender. Any node that you select will be automatically previewed up here. So if I click this canyon, I will see the result, and if I click away, it will disappear. Now, this by itself already looks very nice, and of course on the right here you can edit the settings of the canyon. Let me expand this properties windows, and now you can choose from several styles, from classic to eroded, strata, or even both. For our result, let's go with the eroded. Down here you will always have quite self-explanatory settings to choose from, and it's very easy to just experiment, especially if you set the 512 resolution up here, which will make the computing much faster. I usually start with the 512 and then I go gradually higher with the resolution when I get into the finer details of the landscape creation. And if you realize that you liked your previous settings more, you can of course go back to the previous states in this undo section. Alright, we can have something like this for the scale, about 0.37. the valley to something like 0.4, and the surrounding 0.6. And of course, to search for unique variations, you can always change the seed. Now, even though this is already very nice, let me show you how easy it is to, for example, erode the terrain. Something that's a pure nightmare to do in Blender. And here, you just drag this output socket and type in Erosion. There are several options to choose from, but let's go with Erosion 2. And that's that. It beautifully created these crevices and protrusions and made the canyon erode realistically. And if you decide you want to go for another effect from this erosion family, you can simply switch it up here. But let's return to Erosion 2 and play with some parameters. We can in fact already upscale here to 1K to see more details. The duration is the time over which the simulation happens, which in real-time values is something like millions of years. Next, downcutting is how deep the erosion cuts to the ground. Anyways, as I mentioned, let's not go into every single setting. I'll leave that for future tutorials and for you to explore. So with the erosion node setup, I actually recommend two things. A, go to Tools, Options, and activate the CUDA option here if you can. For me, anytime I tried to do more advanced computations on just CPU, Gaea started crashing. And then B, save your project up here. Now with that out of the way, another node we can add is the river node. and Gaea automatically simulates how the terrain would change if there were rivers in the crevices. And of course, you can control how many streams there should be, how wide the rivers, and how deep they cut into the terrain. One slightly more advanced thing I want to show you is masking. Every single node can be masked to only appear on certain areas. There is all sorts of options here that I can explore in some future tutorials, but for now, let's just click this icon here and choose the height. I only want the rivers to appear down here, at the bottom of the canyon. For that, we can lower this lowest value to go to 0, and then lower the height to about 0.3 to cut it off at the top here. Now sometimes the cutoff can get a little sharp, but that we can sort out by using the falloff, which blends these areas together. Next up, let's add final layer of simulation, and this time let's use some crumbling to create these little caved in areas, but not as deep, so let's lower the duration and strength so it's not as intense. And that's it. Now we have a simple terrain that we can go ahead and texture. Save it, and if you want to see it in more detail, you can go higher, like 2K at this point. Now let's say I wanted to change the seed of the original canyon node, but I want to see how it looks when it's already eroded. If I click the canyon node to edit it, all the erosion effects disappear. However, to lock this eroded result, I simply right-click and choose this lock preview. Or even faster, I hit the F keyboard shortcut. Now there is this green circle here, indicating that the node is locked, and the viewport will keep previewing this node no matter the changes we do elsewhere. If later you'll want to return to the default mode, just hit F again on this node. Okay, now texturing. The fastest way to add colors to your terrain is by using this set map. You just slap it at the end of the graph, and here you have all these interesting gradients to choose from, sampled directly from satellite data. Let's go, for example, with this brownish rock gradient, number 114. Now at this point, the set map colors the terrain, but it doesn't really behave realistically. It's basically just a color gradient going from the top to the bottom. It doesn't know where the peaks are, which would be different color than, let's say, the crevices, the slopes, etc. For that, we need to add this texture-based map, which does exactly that. It allows us to source data from the terrain to make the set map realize where the various parts of it are. You can play with some settings here, but it will make much more sense when we actually plug it into the set map. So do it and lock the set map. And now we can play with the scale, the slope and soil, which changes the mapping of the colors of our terrain and how it appears on slopes and other parts of the mesh. Though this 114 texture might actually not be the best or the richest in color, so we can, for example, switch to this 119. That one seems a little bit better. And with the set map still locked, you can keep playing with the settings of the texture base until you arrive at something you like. Now at this point, you can happily proceed to the export part of this video, if you're okay with this terrain as it is. However, we can also do more and learn a bit about masking in the process. You see, the rivers here weren't really taken into consideration, and I kinda want them to. I want to actually use these rivers here in the rivers node as a mask to color them differently. For that, we will combine two set maps. One is our terrain color, and now let's add another one, which will be blue. For example, this 003 one. And of course, this might be too blue, but don't worry, we can always adjust the color later. This is just for preview purposes. To combine the two set maps, just drag this out dot from one to another, and automatically this combine mask is created, just like in Blender, where we would use the mix color node. Raise the ratio to 1, and now have a look for our rivers node. And let me show you something. Right click on it and show this locked preview mode. And in here, we can actually see what different outputs this node contains. One is this out channel containing the combined node information. There's also this direction pass, the surface pass, and the very much usable depth pass. Here, anything that is red, I want to use to mask out the blue setmap node. So let's close this and use this depth output, dragging it all the way here to the combined node of the two setmaps and here into the mask socket. Nothing's happened, but that's just because the depth is not intense enough at this point. So we can drag out a new connection and add this adjust node in front of the mask socket. At this point it looks like this, masking out where the rivers are, but let me actually connect it to the mask here and lock the combine node. And now play with the adjust node, increasing the multiply value and also hitting this equalize. This checker does the job, bringing out enough data for the rivers to be masked out. What I would also like to do is to remove the blue of the rivers from the top portions here and only leave it in the valley. For that we can use a height mask and output it from the river's out socket. It's just pure white now, but we can limit it to only this region here. And now combine it with the adjust node, plugging it into the combine mask. And then using this minimum factor, it does exactly what we want it to. You can increase the ratio to 1, but let me actually lower it a little bit because I don't want the rivers to be as intensely blue. Alright, at this point a little bit of recap. We started with a canyon node and eroded it with Erosion 2. Then we added some rivers and crumpled those. From this terrain we generated a texture base for the mapping of the textures and we plugged it into our first set map. Then we used the depth of the rivers node and combined it with a second set map to make those rivers blue. To cut them off from the top portions of the terrain, we used this height mask node and combined it with the depth output of the rivers to get rid of those top portions. And now let's export the result to Blender. For that we need to set up several export options. First we set the actual terrain to export. So find the last node with only the terrain information, not the color information, and that would be this orange Crumble node, and drag out a connection from the out socket and add a export node here. And just leave the settings to EXR. You can also drag out a measure node if instead of displacement map you want to be importing an OBJ or FBX. I like to change this to quads, but otherwise I leave it as is. And finally, let's click this last color node, rename it with F2 to base color and hit F3 on it. This little floppy disk icon appears, and that means once we build the terrain, it will save this color information on the disk. Up here you can see the project menu and in it these build settings. Here you can just specify what sort of resolution you want your final terrain to be. We can try the 4K, but you can also choose higher, and then you set up the destination for your export. Finally, in this Exports tab, you just specify the format of the texture you marked with F3 for export. In our case it was the base color, and let's make it PNG. Close it, hit save, and then hit build and export. Once the process is done, you can now go ahead and fire up Blender. Here in the scene we can go ahead and import the terrain. The way I like to do it is either import the mesh. That's easy. Or you can simply add a plane, scale it up like 100 times, and then apply the scale with Ctrl A. Then subdivide it enough, so something like 100 times, to give us some resolution to this place, and also add sub-D modifier with Ctrl 2 to add even more geometry that we can control with these two options. After that, add a displace modifier and create a new texture to it, which you can then open up here and load in our exported EXR map. Now, two things. One, set the coordinates from local to UV here to map the texture onto the plane properly. And two, since we scaled our plane significantly, let's increase the strength here. So something like 100 or 90 will do. Voila! Now just add a BSDF material, drag in the base color into the shader editor, and plug it into the color socket. Here I am quickly switching to the render preview mode, cycles, and GPU computing. And also I'm adding this Nishita sky to the scene's world setting. And yeah, this is very bright. While the texture we want is there, we just want to make it a little darker, for example using this RGB curve. There. And while we're at it, we can take the roughness to 1 and lower the specular to something like 0.05. Terrain from large distance is usually pretty rough and non-reflective. Okay, this doesn't look like the terrain we created in the Gaea, at least not when it comes to the little details. Simple fix, we increase the levels here to give Blender more geometry to work with. Let's say set it to 4 or even 5. You can try adding even more, but I think that already at these levels the terrain looks great. And that's it, my friends. You can then add some clouds and atmospheric fog and play with the shader in Blender even more. If you want to learn how to create environments in Blender from the ground up, you can always have a look at my extensive CG Boost course where I put all of my knowledge. So, did you like this Gaea tutorial? Do you want me to do more? Definitely let me know in the comments below. But with that, stay creative, my friends, and until next time, Martin out.